Hi guys, thanks for tuning in to another video on ForgottenWeapons.com. I'm Ian McCollum, and I'm here today at the Rock Island Auction Company taking a look at some of the guns that they're going to be selling in their upcoming May of 2019 premiere auction. Specifically today we have a Colt Aircrewman revolver. And this is one of the scarcest modern Colt revolvers made because the majority of these were actually destroyed by the Air Force because they weren't really all that safe. So the idea here is that in the early 1950s, the U.S. Air Force, specifically the Strategic Bomber Command, wanted a very lightweight emergency sidearm for aircraft crews, and they contracted actually with both Colt and Smith & Wesson to manufacture these. But we're going to focus on just Colt today because that's the one that we have here to examine. Both the Colt and the Smith & Wesson were designated the M13 revolver without any acknowledgement of the fact that Colt made Colt revolvers and Smith & Wesson made Smith & Wesson revolvers, and the parts are not interchangeable. They are different designs, although they are the same basic specification. So Colt's gun here is basically a modified version of the Colt Cobra. Colt had a number of lightweight revolver offerings at this time, and I should say these were manufactured in 1951 and 1952. And what makes them different from all of the standard Colt lightweight revolvers is that this actually has an aluminum cylinder. So they all have an aluminum frame, an alloy frame. That's what makes them lightweight. They all have steel barrels, but for the Air Force to minimize the weight of the gun, they put in an aluminum alloy cylinder, and that's what would lead to their recall later on. So let's take a closer look. Let me show you what makes this distinctive and why these things are so rare. This thing weighs in at a remarkably small 11 ounces loaded, and it is a 6-shot 38 caliber revolver. It is just incredibly lightweight, and I can only imagine how unpleasant it is to shoot. Now, Colt would make a total of 1,189 of these revolvers in 51 and 52. In 1953, they would add Smith & Wesson. The Air Force would add Smith & Wesson, and Smith & Wesson would make the vast majority of the Aircrewman revolvers on a slightly, well, same basic pattern, but different mechanical setup, being Smith & Wesson guns. A few distinctive things that we can look at. On the right side of the barrel, we have a Colt manufacturing mark. This is just a little 2-inch barrel. We have the model designation. These aren't actually marked M13, but they are marked Aircrewman and 38 special cartridge. The Smith & Wesson examples are actually marked on the top strap. Colt ones are not, but you do have some nice texturing there to prevent glare. Not that you're going to be shooting this particularly precisely. I mean, it's got the same sights as any Colt lightweight revolver, but this is not exactly a precision gun. On the backstrap, we have a very distinctive property of U.S. Air Force marking. Occasionally, these will have been defaced on legitimate guns if people had them in the civilian market and then got scared that they were perhaps stolen government guns because they were marked this way and ground them off. So that is something that comes up occasionally, but typically they will retain this marking. And then they have Air Force serial numbers on the bottom of the butt. So AF number, this is 413. These serial numbers will range from 1 to 1,189. However, this is not the actual Colt serial number. The actual serial number is on the inside of, well, on the frame and on the crane when you open up the cylinder. So this one is 7169LW. These guns were in the same serial number range as all of Colt's other lightweight models like the Cobra. And there was no particular batch of specific serial numbers that was earmarked for the Air Force. They just pulled the frames off the line and started using them. So the Air Force guns will fall between 2901 and 7775 LW. The LW, of course, is lightweight. So if you're authenticating one of these, aside from all of the other regular markings, you want to make sure that the serial number here, the actual Colt serial number, is in the proper range. And lastly, we have the grip medallions, which are actually a U.S. Air Force logo on both sides instead of a Colt medallion. That's a kind of cool little feature there. Now, because this had an aluminum alloy cylinder, and in fact you can see the wear pattern looks a lot like you might expect for aluminum. The finish wears off pretty easily on the outside, but you can see that the flutes in the cylinder still have much more of the original finish. Anyway, because this cylinder is not nearly as strong as steel, the Air Force specified a low pressure, lighter cartridge to actually use in these. It was designated M41, and it was a 130 grain full metal jacket projectile fired at 725 feet per second, so substantially lighter than regular .38 Special. And that was issued with these guns. And with that ammunition, this was a safe gun to fire, although, as I've mentioned already, I'm sure it was not a particularly fun gun to shoot. But hey, if you're the pilot or the navigator of a strategic bomber and you get shot down, comfortable shooting with a survival gun is probably not going to be your biggest priority. I don't know that these were ever used in actual emergency, but they may have been. Now, as for why the Air Force wanted such a ridiculously lightweight gun, the best suggestion I've seen is that it had to do with ejection, that they wanted something, the heavier a gun is strapped to the side of a pilot's vest, the more likely that gun is to actually become a safety hazard under the very high G experience of ejecting from a jet bomber. And so that may explain why such significant steps towards reducing weight were taken. They wouldn't last all that long, however. These revolvers worked fine with the ammunition that was designed for them, the low-pressure M41 ammo. The problem was, if you started putting regular .38 Special in these, then you would have legitimate, serious safety concerns, because that alloy cylinder just couldn't handle pressure of standard .38. So in 1959, the Air Force made the decision to round them up, bring them back in, and destroy them all, because they wanted to replace these guns with steel-framed, basically the same sort of pattern, little snub-nosed, short-barreled revolvers, but with steel frames, where, and I should point out, they actually continued to issue the M41 ammunition, but they wanted guns that, if someone actually dropped in regular .38 ammo, they would still work. And the weight difference between the aluminum and the steel cylinder, in the scope of an Aircrewman's revolver, really not that big a deal. Doesn't matter. So not quite all of the guns actually got rounded up. It wasn't that uncommon. Well, it was uncommon, but some of the guns had been issued out to officers, a lot of officers in the Air Force flying aircraft, and some of these guys had retired, kept their personal guns. Some of them weren't tracked very well and may not have been properly documented. And so a handful of these ended up on the civilian commercial market, where they remain today, making them one of the scarcest modern Colt revolvers out there. As a result, they of course do get counterfeited a fair amount, so it's really cool to be able to take a look at a definite, legitimate, correct, real one like this that we can use as a basis for evaluating others in the future. Of course, if you're interested in having this one yourself, it is coming up for sale at Rock Island in May of 2019, so keep an eye on their website and check out this and all the other cool stuff they've got in their catalog. Thanks for watching.